Jay and Mark Briscoe, the Briscoe brothers, they had a huge career, and Mark, I'm hoping, will still have a huge career. But as a team, we saw them in Impact Wrestling. We saw them in Game Changer Wrestling, GCW, very recently as GCW Tag Team Champions. Really early on, they were in NWA Wildside, Pro Wrestling Noah over in Japan, Jersey All Pro Wrestling, all over the place across the indies. But Ring of Honor is really the place that they called home and where they made so many memorable moments for so many of us. When you look at Ring of Honor as an organization, it's a really fascinating thing because they're just such an important organization in the history of American professional wrestling. And there's multiple eras of them showcasing their place and how important they are. I think the first era, I would split it into thirds, but you could argue there's even more. But the thirds that I look at are the very beginning, the very early 2000s, when Ring of Honor launches. And the reason that that's so important is that was what was left. When ECW went out of business and WWE bought WCW, and WWE was the one big dog. We take for granted now because independent wrestling is thriving. But at that point, independent wrestling was dying. It was dying off, and there was no large independent wrestling body. And there was the internet was around, but it wasn't like you could get everybody's eyeballs onto one thing that wasn't on mainstream television. When ECW went away, ECW was that independent wrestling fixture that allowed people who weren't in WWE or WCW to have this mainstream place to go. When that went away, it was like, you might find a local show running at an armory by you or something, but there wasn't that body. And Ring of Honor took the place of ECW, and it was a completely different product because it went more towards the Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko side of ECW than the Sandman and Sabu side of ECW that ECW became known for. They went for the W in ECW instead of the E. But they basically pulled in all of the best independent wrestlers out there and tried to create this super league. And from the beginning, they took over that spot that ECW held. And that spot was so important because it kept that part of the wrestling industry alive. To me, the second phase of Ring of Honor that you just go, wow, this is such an important spot, is like around 2007-ish. The whole generation of 2006, 2007, 2008, right around towards the end of CM Punk and going forward. Because you look after CM Punk's run, CM Punk comes to WWE, and you go into 2006, 2007, 2008, and that's when we find Kevin Steen, El Generico, Bryan Danielson, Tyler Black, all of these stars that would become Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Bryan Danielson. There's so many more. But if you look, Samoa Joe, if you look at Ring of Honor in 2006, 2007, you see the entire landscape of what became professional wrestling. They fed into NXT, and NXT became, for wrestling fans, for a minute, I think the hottest territory in wrestling. And it was all fueled by this talent that was really cultivated and made a name for themselves and got great in Ring of Honor. And then you go into the third phase, which is, 10 years, maybe a little less, removed from that. It's around 2016-ish. And that's when Ring of Honor becomes the landing spot in America for the Bullet Club. The Bullet Club had been this incredible faction that reached global eyeballs over in New Japan. And once they got to Ring of Honor and that became their American home, Ring of Honor took off again. But when you look at that, that's when you had the Young Bucks. That's when you had Adam Cole, who would go to NXT and then eventually to AEW. That's when Kenny Omega started coming in, Cody Rhodes. It was really Cody Rhodes, the Young Bucks, and you look at it and you realize that what was happening in Ring of Honor in 2016 going into 2017 was what would be AEW. This thing that was happening was what was going to fuel AEW and create the first national promotion on national cable television to compete with WWE in 20 years. That was happening in Ring of Honor. And when you look at these three times, these three eras in Ring of Honor that are spread out over 20 years, the one constant is the Briscoe brothers. The Briscoe brothers are there for all of it. I would highly recommend that you guys spend some time this week and just go on YouTube and look at what the talk is all about. Why everybody is grieving the loss of Jay Briscoe. I mean, you go to the Briscoes come into Ring of Honor and they win their first Ring of Honor Tag Team Championship in 2003. The Briscoes held that title, unprecedented, 13 times. They, of course, won it for the 13th time at Final Battle 2022. That's 20 years. They won their first in 2003. They won their last December of 2022. And you look at this team, and what's amazing is that you look over all the years, all those 20 years of matches, and you've got classics and classics and classics and classics. And when they show up in December of 2022 to face FTR for those Ring of Honor Tag Team Championships, you don't get a tag team that's 20 years in and on their Legends Tour. You get what's been described by many as the greatest dog collar match that's ever taken place. You get a classic match that will live forever for the Ring of Honor Tag Team Championship. A match that main evented Final Battle. That's what you get. You get a Briscoe brothers that were better, even better, as good as they were in 2003, as good as they were in 2006, as good as they were in 2015. They were the best they've ever been. I couldn't believe when I read that Jay Briscoe was only 38 years old because of how much he's already accomplished. I mean, if you want to go back, go into 2007. Look at what was going on in 2007 in Ring of Honor. In 2007, you have the Ladder Wars with the Briscoe brothers versus Kevin Steen and El Generico. I mean, not only is it just an incredible match, but it's the blueprint for the future. It's everything, and it's right there, right in front of our eyes for us to see. That same year, 2007, you talk about Seth Rollins. Seth Rollins as Tyler Black was part of this faction in Ring of Honor called the Age of the Fall that was led by Jimmy Jacobs. Jimmy Jacobs in 2007, there's nobody like him. But there's this moment where the Age of the Fall attacks Jay Briscoe. And Ring of Honor is like one of these promotions that's known for their matches, not their angles. But this angle, this visual, anybody that saw it, this is a forever visual. As they brutally attack Jay Briscoe to the point that you think it's real. And he's profusely bleeding. And they tie up Jay Briscoe's ankles. And they hang him from the ceiling. And he is raining blood down as Jimmy Jacobs cuts a promo directly under him. If that doesn't convince you that you need to see a Briscoe brothers versus the Age of the Fall match, I don't know what will. That is one of the things that made Jay Briscoe such a unique and incredible performer, was the believability. There was no point where you thought that Jay was just playing a character for us, right? Where we're all in on the gag together. Like, no, this is Jay Briscoe is Jay Briscoe is Jay Briscoe. And what's especially unique and especially incredible about that with him is that he could be the top heel or the top babyface in a company at any moment, and you would believe it. You could boo or cheer for him just as easily, and you'd be booing or cheering based on how, as a performer, he wanted you to react. The natural charisma that came off him, along with that level of believability, his promo ability, and his ability in the ring, is why everybody that's ever worked with him is raining praise down on him and will hopefully do it forever. It was Kevin, as good as he was, people were surprised in Ring of Honor when he won, or fans, when he won the Ring of Honor Championship as a singles competitor for the first time. He defeated Kevin Steen in another fantastic match to win that Ring of Honor Championship. And he ended up holding the title twice. He had to give it up. Then he came back. He won it back. And he had a real run. That's when he wrestled Adam Cole. That's when he was wrestling Samoa Joe for the Ring of Honor Championship. I had the great fortune during that Adam Cole-Jay Briscoe rivalry to interview Jay. And I knew this was a while ago. I had no idea how long ago it was. You know, doing the podcast, I forget a lot of the interviews that I do. But there was just something about Jay Briscoe that was so engaging and authentic. You know, when I talked to him for this interview, he was not in character. He was just him. He was just a dude. And even without he wasn't doing any promo, nothing. He was just like, yeah, I want to get to know you, Jay. And he was like, okay, here's who I am. And it was still like, I want to buy a ticket to watch that guy. That's that magic that you don't get too often. And I couldn't believe when I went back and found the interview, which, by the way, if you want to watch it, it's on YouTube. There's a pinned comment under the interview that will direct you to the fundraiser for his family for all their expenses. So the top comment on that video is for the fundraiser. So if you watch that video and you enjoy it, all that information is there if you want it. It was episode 10. We're on episode, what is this, 431 of this podcast? It was episode 10. And he's incredible. I would suggest you go back and watch it if you haven't. I mean, there's a great Ring of Honor match that was the Briscoes versus CM Punk and Colt Cabana, which who would have thought all these years later? All the direction. I mean, that right there will tell you how much things change. And you know what doesn't change? The Briscoe brothers still going out there and having match of the night. The Age of the Fall storyline was such a big deal that in 2007, they main evented Final Battle. And I believe that was the first time that a tag team championship match was the main event for a Final Battle show. Final Battle being Ring of Honor's biggest event of the year. And in 2007, the Briscoes headlined it against Age of the Fall in that Ring of Honor tag team title match. 15 years later, in 2022, we get to Final Battle. And what's the main event? The Briscoes in a Ring of Honor tag team championship match. You know, I mean, you just look at the matches that they had. There's a incredible one. It's on YouTube. It's for free. It's the Briscoes versus Homicide and Eddie Kingston. Homicide and Eddie Kingston, just two of the greatest. Now Eddie Kingston, of course, we see all the time on AEW Dynamite. I mean, matches that you would have assumed never even happened. How about this one? This happened in a Ring of Honor ring. The Briscoe brothers versus Okada and Shinsuke Nakamura. Just up there on YouTube. All this history is right there. I can't imagine the level of loss that close friends are feeling, even further that his family's feeling, even further that his wife and children are feeling right now. It's just it's the type of thing that you can't fathom that level of loss. Most of us can't, and I hope that you never do have to fathom that level of loss, because it must be utterly painful. I think that as wrestling fans, some of the stuff and I'm so glad that the Briscoe brothers gave us, and Jay Briscoe specifically, because he's always going to be known as a tag team wrestler, and he should be. That tag team, the Briscoes are one of the greatest tag teams in the history of professional wrestling, period. But Jay Briscoe is an incredible singles wrestler on his own. This is a former Ring of Honor world champion, and a good one at that. I'm so glad that all of these matches happened in an era when everything was being recorded and everything ends up on the internet, because that way nothing gets lost to time. Everything is findable. Everything is out there. And it makes me glad that Tony Khan owns the tape library and is going to put everything up online for everybody just to make sure that it survives. You know, if somebody else buys Ring of Honor that's not a wrestling fan and doesn't know how to utilize the tape library, where does it all go? I do feel like, as wrestling fans, when you talk about career and when you talk about matches, the stuff that we were robbed of. I mean, the idea of having a Double or Nothing show or an all-out show where you'd have the Briscoes versus the Young Bucks. If you had the Briscoes versus the Young Bucks on an AEW pay-per-view, I guarantee you'd be match of the year. Guarantee. I mean, FTR versus the Briscoes happened in December, and people were like, okay, I'm going to redo my match of the year candidates because that one just got it. The trilogy that they had, the Briscoes and FTR, and I'm so glad those are easily accessible, because, I mean, talk about a high note in terms of professional wrestling. My God, all three of those matches. One of the greatest, I mean, it's in the conversation. When you're talking about great wrestling trilogies, FTR and the Briscoes are right there. But can you imagine that? Can you imagine the Bucks versus the Briscoes on an AEW pay-per-view? Can you imagine having to get to see the Usos versus the Briscoes? Do you understand that the tag team that the Usos have become and the tag team that the Briscoes had become, that would have been a life-changing match. The Usos versus the Briscoes has to go down as one of those dream matches that we can only think, what if? Can you imagine if we had gotten to see it? There are a lot of people, I think, that are becoming more aware of Jay Briscoe's catalog and his contributions to wrestling now that there's so much acknowledgement happening, and I'm happy about that. I'm glad that that's happening. You know, I think that sure, everybody wants to be appreciated, but legacy is important, man. And the stuff that Jay did should last forever. You know, I mean, I would love to see, I don't know how it could ever happen. I would love to see a documentary happen where you had guys in AEW and WWE all talking about why this guy is so special, because he is. Even Triple H put a tweet out about it. Because it's like, yeah, all the nonsense aside, all the everything aside, if we're just wrestling fans talking about wrestling, This guy's one of the great contributors to the business of all time. So yeah, I would go out of my way if I were you to find out, if you don't already know, why people are so obsessed. I mean, to me, it got to a point where in the last 2 years, when the Briscoe brothers were on a show, it elevated that show. When the Briscoe brothers were on a GCW show, it was like, oh man, that's one that you have to go see. That's one that you have to get on the Fight Network. When AEW started putting on the Ring of Honor pay-per-views, it was like, oh, the Briscoes are going to be there? Oh yeah, for sure. Of course I want to see, Jericho and Claudio. Of course I want to see this. Of course I want to see Dalton Castle. But the Briscoe brothers are on that show? Yeah, that's a can't-miss show. They became a can't-miss act, and I'm glad that they got to become a can't-miss act, because they were a can't-miss act for a long time in an organization that just didn't have enough eyeballs on it. I hope that it kicks people in the ass a little, and it's a reminder to be like, hey, this is pro wrestling. We need to take a chance. Whether, whatever's happening, we need to take a chance on people. We need to let people make mistakes, grow from them, recover from them, learn from them, and become better people, and then celebrate what they do in the biggest way humanly possible. And I'm glad that so much time this week was spent celebrating Jay Briscoe in the biggest way humanly possible. If you want more information on how to help his family out, there'll be info in the podcast description, or if you're watching on YouTube, there'll be info in the YouTube description as well as pinned comment to learn how to help his family and how to help him out and everything.